He mihi nui ki a koutou, i ngā waka, i ngā reo, i ngā mana, rau rangatira mā. Ko te aroha taku maunga, ko waiho taku awa, ko waikato taku tūranga waiwai. He piko, he taniwha, he piko, he taniwha, waikato, taniwha rau. Tihei Māori ora. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. In the words of our Māori people, our Indigenous language of New Zealand, I would like to honour the Gadigal land and peoples and say to you all, with all of your languages, with all of the ways that you came to this land, and the mana, we say the mana, the respect that I hold for you as educational leaders. Tēnā koutou to those who have passed, tēnā koutou to those who are present, tēnā koutou katoa to those who are in our future. Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here in Sydney. And I'd like to sincerely thank ACEL and NZELs for giving me both the honour and the privilege of speaking with you today. I mean, what an amazing conference. My head is just full of ideas. My papers are scrawled now with just brilliance of thoughts that have come through over the last 2 days. And I really want to honour the theme of the courage and commitment as we celebrate, or commemorate, should I say, the 100 years of the Anzacs and of the First World War. There's been many, many great stories of courage and commitment of the men who went to fight for their country, particularly in New Zealand and Australia over the last 100 years as these commemorations have been taking place. I think of my own family, my own relatives, of my great uncles who fought and died in World War I. And for we Kiwis and Aussies, how that trip to Gallipoli is almost a pilgrimage, seeing the huge cliffs the men had to scale, seeing the trenches, the Lone Pine Memorial, and looking across that to looking for the names of relatives that were lost in battle, and the pride we have in our Anzacs. And my first trip to Gallipoli in 1982 meant so much to me, but I kept thinking while I was there, supping tea with the Turkish soldiers under the tents, at what a different reception I was receiving 67 years later than our Anzacs were receiving at that time. But I sincerely honour these men, the Mark Donaldsons, who went to war and are still going to war throughout the world with such courage and commitment. But this led me to think about all of the great stories of courage and commitment that we didn't know, that we didn't really get told, that weren't really in our schools or in our schooling. And we still don't even get told, even through the New Zealand Herald 100 Great Stories of Courage and Commitment, or the books or the videos that have been produced this year to commemorate 100 years. The stories about the women who took over the farms when the men left, the land girls, the women who worked in the factories, making the ammunitions and the clothing for the men, the women who went to war, the women as spies like Pippa Doyle, who was 23 when she dropped into France, or Nancy Wake, the White Mouse, the most wanted and most decorated woman of World War II, and wanted by the Gestapo. And women nurses such as Lottie Gillalay and Eva Brooke, or the fearless campaigner like Etty Rout, a Tasmanian-born New Zealander whose work was on stopping venereal diseases among the servicemen in Paris and in the Somme during World War I, which made her a real war hero among the French, even though through the same events she became persona non grata in New Zealand. At that time, and through many years later, her story was not allowed to be told, but she was known as the guardian angel of the Anzacs. And the Australian Aborigines, who weren't allowed to go to fight as Australians in the war, but they had the courage and commitment to do it anyway, Some of them changed their nationality to Spanish and they signed up. And the Australian Army actually became the first EEO employer in Australia. And the New Zealand Maori who initially weren't allowed to fight. And then they were called to fight. And the conflict and tension that caused many Maori who wondered why they would go and fight for a country who had dispossessed them of their land in the previous century. And the Waikato Maori, whose king had told them to lay down their weapons and never pick them up again after the land wars in New Zealand, who showed the courage and commitment by not going to fight and were jailed for their actions. And then the Māori who showed the courage and commitment and signed up anyway, hoping that fighting alongside their fellow countrymen might mean that they were seen more equally on their return. And their blood-curdling war cry of the haka was feared across the battlefields of Gallipoli. These were all the hidden stories, all the untold stories. But that time too, with all of the injustices that were being raised to the public eye, was actually the time of redressing those injustices. And that's what I would like to focus on today. That women's calls for equal pay, for equal work, started at that time when women were working in the factories beside men doing the same jobs for much less pay. And Indigenous rights were also highlighted. And many leaders have since worked since that time to lessen the impact of injustice. Our QC, Peter Williams, died earlier this year, and they say he was quite possibly the best defence barrister that New Zealand has ever seen, and he was successful in some really high-profile court cases. He was a fearless campaigner for human rights, and he had the courage to speak up for the underdog. He acted in courts for those who had no money. He raised awareness about issues of social justice. He often offered his services free to the protesters that ended up in the courts, sharing the moral outrage for the various issues that they stood up for. And at the heart of them all was his unparalleled hunger for justice. He tried to understand all people, even murderers. Such views were not popular, but he never shied from expressing them. And people said about him at his funeral, he just never made judgments on people as he negotiated this river of injustice, trying to reduce its number of victims. I'd like to tell you a story about another river, the river that runs through my city of Hamilton in New Zealand, the Waikato. And this artwork is by my colleague Don Ratana from the University of Waikato. He gave this to me when I left the institution some years ago to go to London. And it depicts the great fleet of Maori canoes coming to New Zealand, and it shows the Waikato River with all of the corners of that river. And that's where he piko is the corner, he taniwha, he piko, he taniwha. Waikato, taniwharo, Waikato, the river of 100 chiefs that I said in my mihi today. You see, in Māori legend, the taniwha is usually thought to be a spirit that lives in the water, and its role is to protect the area in which it lives and guard it against wrongdoers. Taniwha can appear in many shapes and sizes, and they can become mischievous, and they can play tricks on people, but they can also be outsmarted by people. But the word taniwha can also be used to refer to very important chiefs. And this Waikato proverb is that there is a chief at every corner of the river. So I would like to ask you, where are you in relation to this river? This is our role as leaders in education, to lessen the impact of the river of injustice. Are we the 100 chiefs on all of those corners? He piko, he taniwharo, who has that strong moral purpose for fairness and social justice. The influence that we have on our lands from east to west, from north to south, to influence communities, governments, future leadership, is greater, I believe, than the majority of educators have ever stopped to think about. We have choices as we travel this river, the ports we call into on the way, and whether we are actually on the river, navigating to mitigate the effects of injustice, or whether we're just standing on the banks, looking on and watching it flow past. Where are you? My colleague Jerry Starrett always used to say the most important question that we can ask is leadership for what? As Mark Donaldson also said yesterday, why are you doing what you're doing? And if it's not leadership for social justice and equity, what is it for? Our role as leaders in education is to have that courage and commitment to continually lessen the impact of the river of injustice. So can you imagine that cry echoing over the hills of Gallipoli? The Turkish soldiers really feared that sound and moved into psychological warfare. But following that Māori act of pacifism during the war, further downstream, a chief, a New Zealand government leader, went to talk to the Māori people of the Waikato and asked them, why? Why wouldn't you go to fight? And their explanation then about the injustices of their land confiscations and how their king had asked them to lay down their arms forever became the start of the first of the courageous acts of leadership with moral purpose towards justice and compensation for Māori in New Zealand today through the treaty settlements. This was the beginning of hearing about those injustices and beginning to settle them. And so as I think about these young people in our schools today, and as we think about those young people that we heard in that panel there this morning, I'm asking us all to ask the hard questions about are we developing the future chiefs who will ask the questions and will listen along that river of injustice, and will they work to alleviate their impact? And when I hear our panel talk about the importance of character and social justice and international affairs and volunteering and the political causes that they are standing up for and the future careers they want, whether it's in immigration law or public policy or community development, I feel great heart. But as they said so astutely, what would the other the bottom 25% of our communities be saying in those same answers to those same questions? Do all of our students leave school understanding fairness and equity? As Levinson said, we have to get our students to be advocates for these causes, and we have to be alongside them in that process. Because we need also to be the change as we paddle those currents in education. As Bruce Robertson told us last night when he said, I have to behave differently in terms of being such a powerful force. So how do we make a difference? And are we able to be and live what that difference is in our own sphere of influence in our communities? School context, as Elma mentioned yesterday, they are unique. They're like the river. They're always moving. And while we can see the next corner, we can't see all that there is ahead, but we can learn the way there. We know the delta is up there somewhere, the vision, the richness, the outcome of our journey. We can navigate one corner at a time successfully if we have an awareness of our surroundings. But it's easy to get caught up in the day-to-day, isn't it? Reacting to the challenges, the currents, the eddies. Easy to start heading up the different tributaries and losing sight of the vision and the destination. As Degenhardt and Dignan